Do you feel like giving thanks to bread this morning?
Carl talking about. Good morning, everyone. Before we begin, Joshua, would you start off with a word of prayer?
Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing us together to learn more about your words. We pray that during this class we will gain practical knowledge and continue to gain more as we see them. Please, I pray again.
Okay, we're going to continue on our study from Matthew chapter 9. We'll open up your Bibles there, do some reading. Matthew chapter 9, and we'll start off by reading verses 9 through 13. And Charles, would you read that? Nine through 13. Okay, and if we've been doing, we're going to read the other two parallel accounts at the same time, and then we're going to go back and forth and discuss it. I'll ask you some questions. So let's flip over now to Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2, we're going to read verses 13 through 17. And June, would you read those? Yeah, Mark 2, 13 through 17.
And he went out again by the seashore, and all the people were coming to him, and he was teaching them. As he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting in the temple. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And it happened that he was reclining at the table in his house, and many tax collectors and sinners were dining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many of them, and they were following him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why is he eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners?" And hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners."
Okay, now let's look at Luke chapter 5. And we'll read verses 27 through 32. Luke 5, verses 27 through 32. And Bob, would you read those?
And after these things he went forth and saw a boat named Levi sitting at the receipt of custom, and he said unto him, "Follow me." And he left off scribe and Pharisee murmured against the disciples, saying, Why do you eat and drink with those of the Sabbath? And Jesus answered, said unto them, They that are whole need not a physician, but they which are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance.
Okay, and we know before this, Jesus is in Capernaum. And right before this, he had forgiven the sins and healed the man that was paralyzed that they let down through the roof. And he was teaching in the house. In the house he was teaching, there were so many people there teaching that, he was listening, that the house was packed with people that they couldn't get the man with the bed even in the house. Now after that was where we're at now. Matthew says as Jesus passed on from there, and Luke says after these things he went out. Mark's version gives us a little bit more information. It says he went out again by the sea. We know he's in Capernaum, so this is the Sea of Galilee. So he goes out by the Sea of Galilee, and all the multitude came to him, and he taught them. So he moves. He was in a house that was full of people, and he goes out to the sea, and the multitude's following him, and he's still teaching. Of course, we know that's what Jesus did. He went around teaching and healing. That's what he did most of the time. And as he's teaching, Matthew 9:9, it says he saw a man named Matthew. And as Chris brought out on Wednesday, the Greek word translated saw here doesn't mean he just looked at him. It means he knew everything about him, what was in his heart, what kind of person he was, and he even knew his past. So Jesus knew what kind of person Matthew was. He had that ability. We find the name Matthew only 5 times in the New Testament. Once right here in Matthew 9:9. And then in the other 4 times, it's in the list of the 12 apostles, Matthew. And that's all the times that we find the name Matthew in the New Testament. Let's turn over now and read from Matthew chapter 10 and verse 3. We find Matthew listed among that 12 apostles. Matthew 10 and verse 3. And Thad, would you read that? If he is, he's quite a lot older than I thought he was. Okay, we see with Matthew, the tax collector is listed here in the list of 12 apostles, and this is the same Matthew. But Matthew was also known by another name. What was his other name? Levi. He was a tax collector, and Mark and Luke's accounts, he's called, and Mark, let me find my notes so I don't misspeak. In Luke's account, it says Levi, the tax collector. And how is he described in Mark's version, his account of this?
The son of Alphaeus.
Levi, the son of Alphaeus. That's right. So he's a tax collector, right?
So James is also the son of Alphaeus. Does that mean James brothers, or are we just like there's another Alphaeus?
One step at a time. You're going to mess up my notes here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, yeah. We find Matthew 5 times in the New Testament, and then we find the name Alphaeus 5 times in the New Testament also. Once here in Mark, and then the other 4 times, again, when we have the list of the apostles. And those 4 times he's listed as James, the son of Alphaeus. So nowhere in the New Testament can I find anything that refers to Matthew and James as brothers. And it's very obvious that that we know that Peter and Andrew were brothers and James and John were brothers. It tells us that. But nowhere do we find that Matthew and James were referred to as brothers. So could they have been brothers? Yes, absolutely, because Matthew was the son of Alphaeus. And we know James was the son of Alphaeus, but we don't have anywhere that tells us that. So it's possible, and then again, it could very well have been 2 different Alphaeuses, absolutely. So we don't know that, and I can't say that for a fact. And maybe that was a common name, but we do know that Levi was a common name in the Jewish, because when you read about Jesus' genealogy in Luke chapter 3 and verse 24 and verse 29, the name Levi is found there. So it was a fairly common name for the Jews. And now I have to catch up with my notes here. So his name is Matthew. He's also known as Levi, and he was a tax collector. And we talked about that a little bit already on Wednesday evening. And where was he? Where was Matthew when Jesus saw him? Sitting at his office. He was sitting at the tax office. Exactly. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke all say the same thing. He was sitting at the tax office. So, and we already discussed on Wednesday. Chris brought out that tax collectors weren't looked at in a very favorable way back then. And he read some verses already that we know that some of the tax collectors took more than they should have. They didn't take their fair share. They took more than their fair share. So a lot of the people didn't like them. And the fact that they were Jews, which would have been employed by the Roman government, that made them not like them also. So they weren't looked at in a very favorable way. And Jesus used this attitude that the Jews had towards tax collectors to his advantage in his lessons, didn't he? Let's read a few of those verses that show that he used that to try to teach. Let's look at Matthew chapter 5. Verses 46 and 47. Matthew 5, 46 and 47. And Michelle, would you read those?
For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so?
Okay, he's trying to teach them, of course, here, that not to do everything just for face value. They need to be coming from the heart. And you can see here that he's using the tax collectors as an opposite. Don't the tax collectors do this? So he's using their attitude towards them to try to teach here. And we find the same thing in Matthew chapter 18 and verse 17. Let's flip over there and read that. And Brian, would you read that?
And if he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. But if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and the tax collectors.
Okay, here Jesus is teaching about if a brother sins against you, the one that has been offended needs to go to that brother and have a talk with him. We know we read in the New Testament both ways. If you've wronged someone, it's your responsibility to go to them and try to straighten it out. If you've been wrong, you go to that person and try to straighten it out. That's what Jesus teaches here. And if he wasn't here, then if he doesn't hear you, you take some witnesses with you. And then here in verse 17, if he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector. So again, you can see their attitude towards tax collectors wasn't very good. And but Jesus uses this in his teaching to get that across to them how they would be. Let's flip over now and read from Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7, we'll just read verses 29 and 30. And this is Jesus talking about John the Baptist. Luke 7, 29 and 30. And Evan, would you read that?
All people that heard it, publicans just like God, be baptized with the baptism of John. The Pharisees and lawyers rejected the counsel of God against themselves, being not baptized.
Okay, here, Jesus, even the tax collectors justified God and was baptized by him. But Pharisees and the lawyers, which we know, which means the same thing as scribes, they rejected him, and we know that. So they rejected John too, as we know they rejected Jesus for the most part. So again, Jesus liked to use their attitude to teach them. And we've already talked about in Luke 18, a parable where the two men are up praying, and one was a Pharisee and the other was a tax collector. Again, using the tax collector as an example, those that the Jews kind of look down upon, and uses them to look at them in a lesson, and to watch their attitude towards people. They had a bad attitude towards tax collectors. And sometimes maybe it was justified, but as a whole, they just looked at tax collectors like they were scum. And there was some that wasn't that way. And Jesus used that to his advantage in some of his teaching. So we know that the Jews didn't look at tax collectors very favorably. And Jesus sees Matthew now at his job, sitting at the tax office. And what did Jesus say to Matthew? Follow me. Yeah, he asked Matthew to follow him. And is this something?
To make him a good collector or a bad one?
Will you tell me?
Yeah.
We don't-
But he said he could see into his mind.
Well,
So he
Jesus
knew what he was thinking.
Jesus knew his heart.
That's what I meant.
And he ended up being an apostle, so I'm assuming he was a good guy. Jew. I don't think he would have an apostle. It was a bad one.
Okay.
Either that or he changed at some point. But there were some tax collectors that did the right thing. We may have time to
What
get
I'm
to it.
saying was Matthew doing the right thing.
Matthew did the right thing?
Yeah, not overcharge people.
Well, I would assume not, since Jesus chose him, but we don't know that for a fact. And again, no one's perfect. Maybe he made some mistakes and did something about it. So just because the Jews looked down upon him didn't mean they were all that way.
They were all bad.
Exactly. Carl?
Well, in other words, Matthew must have had some means, because in Luke it says, Levi made him a great feast in his own house. So that required some money to do that.
Right, absolutely.
There were a lot of people at the feast fed.
Yep. He had a steady job, right? That doesn't mean he was stealing from anybody, right? Still, we don't know that one way or another. I don't want to say one way or another, but he was doing fairly well. He had a house and he had a lot of people over. We're going to get to that just a little bit, but yes, absolutely. Zacchaeus was a tax collector, and it says he was rich, but that's still. And Zacchaeus says, "I haven't. If I made a mistake, I made it right." Zacchaeus tells Jesus that. Yes, Brian, go ahead.
I think it's interesting too when we think about the apostles. I guess I would say I don't know if it's right to think of them as Jesus chose a bunch of good people to get together to be an apostle and saint. He chose the exact opposite of the people that he would have chosen and what people would expect him to choose if he was choosing good people, according to like what was considered good by those in the Jewish faith at that time. It's like he's purposely choosing people who need to be transformed, right? Like Matthew in particular. And I don't know, it's hard to fully grasp like what somebody in that position would be like or like would be perceived as in like a close group of people, some of which were who've been I don't know, who are Jewish and have a long history in that, and whereas Matthew, imagine if like the United States was occupied by a foreign power like they were the Romans, right? And the foreign power was oppressing us and like overtaxing us, making life very difficult for us. And some of us here went and sided with them and were helping them carry out their oppression, taxes and stuff. That would be hard to sit down at a table with them or to work together with them to do that. And I think that's one of the things that Jesus is doing. He's like, of course, breaking assumptions and breaking down barriers, showing that his kingdom is open to everyone, and his and following him can transform anyone, which he does. And all the disciples were not like really good, strong people. And we were betrayed by his own disciples, by what he possible. And many others are like they all have their own weaknesses, but they were able to come together despite those things. Because of their obedience to Jesus. I don't know, I just find that interesting, kind of to think about. He wasn't necessarily that he wasn't chosen because he was one of the good tax collectors. Right? It was very hard to be like wealthy in those days without without some kind of, it's not like today where a good chunk of the people are doing really well. This is very unique in history, the way we have it in the United States right now. Oftentimes, people got wealthy through dishonest means, through siding with the enemy, siding with the occupier, that kind of thing. So, kind of like it's kind of what runs through my mind when I think of what Jesus is doing here, like choosing Matthew in particular as a tax collector. He's going to be sitting next to like Simon the Zealot, right? Which are the Zealots were people who would like strongly oppose the Roman occupiers, those who sided with them, and yet they had to sit at the table together and eat a meal. Yeah, so I mean, that's.
Well, yeah, none of them were perfect, were they? It doesn't matter who he chose, none of them were perfect, absolutely. Go ahead.
And one of the commentators where it says Jesus came not to call the righteous but the sinners, there weren't any righteous, and he was kind of zinging the Pharisees when he said that.
Yeah, as we get into this story, what Brian's getting at is exactly what he's trying to make a point at here, isn't he? I mean, their attitude towards other people. It's the Pharisees and the scribes specifically, but that's exactly what we're getting at in this story, was their attitude towards others. And we know that Peter, Andrew, James, and John were fishermen. Matthew was a tax collector. They had a lot of different things that they did when Jesus called them. And the purpose for him calling them specifically, we don't know. We're not told. But we know that, I think it's in Luke, the night before he chose the 12, he was in prayer all night to God. So was he talking to God about who he was going to choose among his disciples? We don't know. We're not told that, but it's definitely possible he was talking to his Father about, what do you think about this or that? We don't know. But he was in prayer all night, and the next morning, the next day is when he chose those 12. And he had a purpose for choosing who he did. And we know from many other verses that Jesus even knew who was going to be the one who was going to betray him. And he still chose him and knew he had to choose him. So that would have been a difficult choice for all of us to choose the 12. Jerry?
Christ knew everything before he had.
Yes, he did.
He was going to train who God told him to choose.
Yeah, he knew ahead of time, absolutely. But did Jesus ask anybody else other than Matthew to follow him? Was Matthew the only one? Well, it was fairly common. We can't say he did it all the time, but we find several examples of Jesus telling others, come follow me. Let's flip over to Mark chapter 10 and read verse 21. Mark 10, verse 21. Lajana, would you read that?
And Jesus beholding him loved him and said unto him, What thing thou lackest? Go thy way, sell whatsoever thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven. And come, take up the cross, and follow me.
Okay, here we have the rich young ruler wanting to know what he still lacked yet. And Jesus tells him here to, knowing that he had how he felt about money, and he tells him to go and sell everything and give to the poor and come, take up your cross and follow me. So again, another example of saying, follow me. Now let's flip over to Luke chapter 9, and we'll read verse 59. Luke 9 and verse 59. Stacy, would you read that?
He said to another, Follow me. But he said, Lord, let me first go and bury my father.
Okay, we have talked about this recently, about somebody said he would go follow him, but Jesus, I don't know if you want to do that because I don't have any place to lay my head. And then he tells this other person, follow me. And this one says, let me first go and bury my father. So again, Jesus did say, follow me to others. We won't take the time to read it right now. But in John chapter 1, verse 43, he says the same thing to Philip, follow me. And of course, in Matthew chapter 4, Peter and Andrew, he says, follow me. As they're fishing, follow me. So we can read several accounts where Jesus asked others to follow him. So back in Matthew chapter 9, Matthew's there sitting at the tax office. Jesus sees him, knows about him, knows his heart, and Jesus asked him to follow him. What did Matthew do? Yeah, in Matthew and Mark, it says he rose and followed him, but Luke says he left all, rose up, and followed him. And from what I could read, the Greek word that's translated left all here means to leave behind, to abandon. Otherwise, he walked away, got up, he left all, and went and followed Jesus. So that would have took some commitment on his part, wouldn't it? Just to get up and walk away. And we already know he had a steady job and was apparently making good money. And he got up and walked away from that and followed Jesus. Let's look over at John chapter 8 and verse 9. John 8 and verse 9. And Richard, would you read that?
And they which heard it, being convinced by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst.
Okay, this is where they come to Jesus and they have found this. They've got this woman. They said, we caught her in the act of adultery. And Jesus, whoever is without sin, throw the first stone. And then here in verse 9, those that heard that, convicted of their conscience, went out one by one. The point I want to bring out is it says here that Jesus was left alone. That's the same word that we read about when Levi left all. So you can see that they walked away and left Jesus behind. All the rest of them left. They left him behind. So you can see that's the idea. And in Mark chapter 14, when Jesus was arrested, in verse 50, they all forsook him and fled. And it says that there was a young man that followed after. And some of them tried to grab him and actually pulled some of his clothing off. And he left it behind. He just kept on running. He didn't go back and get that clothing, but you can see it when he left it behind. So the idea here that Levi just left all. He left it behind and went and followed Jesus. And we read about others that did exactly the same thing. Let's turn over to Matthew chapter 4 now. We see here Peter and Andrew and James and John are all called here, and they do that. They believe. Matthew chapter 4, we're going to read verses 18 through 22. Matthew 4, 18 through 22. And Roger, would you read those?
Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brothers, Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishing. And he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. They immediately left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, and the boat of Zebedee the father, mending their nets. He called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him.
Okay, so he calls Peter and Andrew, and then later he calls James and John. And what was their response? It says immediately, both counts. Peter and Andrew immediately, James and John, it says immediately. They dropped what they were doing and they went and followed him, just as we see that Matthew did here in Matthew chapter 9. So there are others that did exactly as Matthew did. They left all of them and followed Jesus. Yes, Terry?
People, excuse me, these people knew who Jesus was and what he did. And for them to be called by him, for him to say, hey, come with me, there was no hesitation. I'm trying to put myself in that position. I probably, after I woke up from fainting, I would probably be hung up his tail. I wouldn't think twice about it. So even if I thought I was not worthy, just for him to acknowledge me and run, to ask me to do that, these guys had to be like in awe. Yeah, I'm on my way. So it's just amazing to me, the thought process.
Well, they were willing to go with him, whether or not they, as we've talked about before, at this point, we're not too sure that they realized he was the Son of God, of course, but they knew he had power to heal and a lot of other things, and the way he taught was different than everybody else, and they were definitely impressed with all that.
And like it says on there immediately, and they didn't think about it. They went. They just dropped it and go, I'm gone.
Right? Which would have been hard to do. Yes, Dad?
Yeah, I know what we're talking about, but they immediately said, come and follow me, and they did. And then the one there said, well, let me go bury my father. Just as, to me, it comes as an excuse, If you really believe that this is Jesus, you would immediately do that. And we find the same things if you're having a study with a non-Christian. Yeah, I hear what you say and what you had me to read, but I'm going to wait a while, and they don't realize they're sitting there, their soul is lost. And sometimes because you hesitate, our days are numbered. You don't know when your number comes up. So it's just, it's just some people don't take it serious enough at that time.
Right. Sometimes maybe they don't really realize. And then some of us takes a little longer for things to soak into, maybe, I don't know, but absolutely. Carl, you had your hand up too?
Yeah, along with what Billy said, all of this brings out that if we're going to follow Christ, that comes first. Because we've studied other places, we've got responsibilities to take care of our family and work and support the church. We've got all of those responsibilities, but still Christ comes first. And all of these passages we've been reading here this morning, as well as what Billy said, you got to go to bury dad. But if you're going to follow Christ, you've got to do that first. That other stuff is secondary. And the same way with the rich guy. He had a lot of possessions. It just shows that if you're going to follow Christ, that becomes the number one point in our life.
Yeah, if we want to be pleasing in God's sight, we will be, absolutely. It isn't always that way with a lot of people or some people, but
pleasing to Him, it will be that way.
Right. It is to be our priority. And we can see that Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and Matthew made this a priority. They got up and followed Jesus. In Luke 5, it says that those same four, it says they forsook all and followed Jesus. So again, the same idea of Matthew, that he left all, they forsook all, he went off and left. And in Matthew 19:27, we won't take time to read it, but there Peter says, we have left all and followed you. And kind of what are we going to get out of this? And Jesus goes on to teach him, of course. So again, it did take some commitment for them to just pack up and go with him. And again, that's a lesson for us, as has been brought out here. We make a commitment to God and to Jesus and follow his word. That's what we need to do. Be committed to it. Make that our priority if we want to be pleasing to God. Let's read some verses now from John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, we're going to read verses 2 through 4. And Ann, would you read those?
But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the porter openeth. And the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name, and leadeth them out. When he hath put forth all his own, he goeth before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice.
Then I'm going to read verse 27. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. So again, we're Jesus teaching a lesson here that he's the good shepherd, and we're to follow him. And we can read here that there were several others in the New Testament that did exactly that. But we have the same responsibility to follow Jesus, to do what he says. And when it says here, we know his voice. He's talking here about the new law and the New Testament. If we're going to know his voice, we need to sit down and study the word. That's how Jesus speaks to us today. God speaks through his son in the new law. And so if we're going to follow him, we got to apply the New Testament to our lives in that way, and we follow him that way, just as they followed him. Let's turn over now to 1 John chapter 2 real quick. I'm going to read verses 3 through 6. Well, for time, let's just read verse 3. 1 John chapter 2, and we'll read verse 3. And Dad, would you read that?
And hereby we do know that we know him if we keep his commandments.
Okay, if we're going to follow Jesus and if we want to be known of Jesus, how do we do that? Keeping his commandments, following his word, following his voice. That's how we do it. So it takes commitment, doesn't it, and priority. It's already been brought out for us to do so. So we have an example of several of the apostles here where Jesus said, follow me, and they did. And again, that's a good example for us to follow Jesus and do what he said. And in Mark 8:34, Jesus says that they needed to deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. So again, it takes some commitment, some priority to deny ourselves and put Jesus first and God first to make it God pleasing, if we want to be pleasing to God. So Matthew gets up, and back to Matthew chapter 9, Matthew gets up and follows Jesus. And now we read about Jesus is at Matthew's house. And in Luke 5, verse 29, it says, Levi gave him a great feast in his own house. So he gave a dinner in honor of Jesus, basically. And we read there in Luke 5, verse 29, a great number of tax collectors and others. Matthew and Mark says many tax collectors and sinners. So tax collectors and sinners, tax collectors and others. We just know there was a great number of them. And we know there specifically says tax collectors. So a good chance a lot of these were friends and colleagues of Matthew because he was a tax collector. So I've met this man. Why don't you guys come over for dinner and you guys can meet him too, which we've done that. Done the same kind of thing. And you can see why that would happen. So they sat down with Jesus and his disciples, these tax collectors and sinners, and they're eating and talking. And it says in Mark 2, verse 15, that there was many and they followed him. So they were intrigued by Jesus and his teaching. It says here they followed him. In Luke 15, verse 1, it says the tax collectors drew near to hear him. They wanted to listen to him. And in Matthew 11, 19, Jesus is referred to as a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Why would Jesus be looked at that way by tax collectors and sinners? Katie?
Treated them with love.
He was approachable, exactly. He talked to them and they asked questions. You could see that Jesus interacted with them all. He didn't, part of the lesson that we're talking about here and what we read in the Sermon on the Mount was the Pharisees' attitude and the Sadducees and those, the scribes, towards others and how they thought they were better than others. And Jesus wasn't that way. These tax collectors and these sinners, they could see that Jesus was approachable. They could go up to him and talk to him, and they appreciated that, and they responded. And we see that here. And so he's there. He's there teaching and eating with the tax collectors and sinners, and as usual, the Pharisees, the scribes and the Pharisees don't like what they're seeing. I don't know if Chris will continue on there or not. Thank you for your comments.
Oh, yeah. But even there was things that they just didn't understand. They didn't know it all. It was like what you said, one of the days that you have to this guy's power professionals. Terry, the field is one that's it's just assumption.
Tell me what shirts you want.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I have thought about it. I'm still kind of thinking about it, but
Are you? You're okay. Thanks for.
That's for somebody that's what you're saying is
Just a little bit material.
Okay.
Right, well,
Yeah, right, I have to go in there. If it's not broke, don't fix it.
Yeah. So, you know, you know, I'm just like a. Thank you.
okay.